Hey, Shalom Israel. Yahweh Bashim Yahweh Shah Barakatham. Yahweh Shamal Thumb Bashim Yahweh Shah. This is the ISUPK under Commander General Yohana. Started out at 1 West 125th Street, Harlem, New York. You're tuned in with Precinct Officer Howard Moore, ISUPK, Kentucky. And this is our Monday night history class. Now, before we get into the topic, I want to shout out ISUPK, Kentucky. I want to invite every so-called Black, Hispanic, and North American Indian to tune in to our weekly content. Of course, Monday night history class, 9 p.m. to 11 p.m. Tuesday night brotherhood class, taught by Officer of 1,000, I'm a Wonga boy. Wednesday law class, taught by Officer of 1,000, ISUPK. And Wednesday night, 9 p.m. to 10 p.m., the podcast, the baddest podcast around, the baddest podcast in Kentucky, hands down. Cry Out, Spare Not podcast, hosted by Officers of 1,000, I'm a Wonga boy, and ISUPK. And come here, these two powerful priests of the Lord break down biblically the viral videos going across the internet. Now, again, ISUPK, Kentucky, man, Monday night history class. Topic of tonight, Forgotten American Indian Culture, episode 2. Forgotten American Indian Culture, episode 2, part 2. And tonight we finna get into exactly what it said. We finna get into American Indian culture, forgotten American Indian culture. Culture that's not in the textbooks. American Indian culture you ain't grew up hearing about in school. All right, and we finna get it on. Only how ISUPK Kentucky can do it. And of course, Monday night I do a little slideshow or whatever. So let's go ahead on and let's get into these slides. Again, forgotten American Indian culture. There's gonna be part 2. All right, forgotten American Indian culture, part 2. And if you're not familiar with these two people on the screen here, we finna get into it tonight. All right, forgotten American Indian culture, ISUPK Kentucky, under Commander General Yohana, Monday night history class. All right, the first thing we finna get into is a definition. All right, American Indian, a person having origins in any of the original people of North and South America, including Central America. So off the top, again, we got to start out with a definition. American Indian, a person having origins in any of the original people of North and South America, including Central America. And I'm going to walk down the continuity of the culture between South, Central, and North America. Let's walk. All right, 60% of the food consumed worldwide originated in the New World. Now, why is that important? I say it all the time. You can't have a culture unless you've got a food culture. All right, you have to be able to sit down long enough to understand how crops work, right? To understand how husbandry works, right? You got to have a thorough knowledge of the heavens. You got to have a thorough knowledge of the seasons, of the phases of the moon, right? To understand how farming works, to be able to sit down long enough to create a culture. All right, so again, if you don't got a food culture, you don't got a culture. That's the importance of the slide here. 60% of the food consumed worldwide originated in the New World. All right, we're gonna start with the Virgin of Guadalupe. Now, this is where the Catholics, especially in Central and South America and the old Spanish colonies, this is where they get their Virgin of Guadalupe from. Their so-called version of the worship of Virgin Mary. All right, the weeping ceremony was connected with agricultural rites. Corn deities were weeping deities. They shed fertilizing tears, and the sower simulated the sorrow of divine mourners when they cast seed in the soil to die so that it might spring up as corn. Now, this is the origin of these weeping women or these weeping deities. All right. And the origin of the Lady of Guadalupe, or the Catholic version of Virgin Mary, actually comes from an American Indian goddess named Tanatsa. Now, she was an agricultural goddess. She was the goddess of corn, which is still today the most important grain on the entire planet. All right. Corn is the most important grain on the entire planet. All right. She's a corn goddess. She's a weeping deity because one of her children was slain. You see, she got the sun above her head, the stars on her back, the moon under her feet, and we see the corn. All right. And again, we read about the weeping deities just a few slides ago, how it's symbolic of the rain dealing with agriculture. And again, all this goes back to corn. And again, corn is the most popular, the most important grain on the planet. All right. And it originates right here with the indigenous people of North, Central, and South America. All right. Indigenous societies believed that corn was a gift from the gods and an important source of life. All right. The corn that allowed the Maya to abandon their nomadic lifestyle and flourish to the height of their civilization. They in turn nurtured and venerated this amazing plant to the point that it decorated their myths, art, and landscape like no other food source. So corn was the grain to get the indigenous people of the Americas to sit down in one spot. All right, again, the indigenous people had to learn how to chart the stars, chart the heavens, chart the phases of the moon, right? The 4 seasons, you dig? And this is how they were able to sit down long enough to create a culture and create a civilization based around this one plant. All right, again, if you can't sit down long enough, you can't sit in one spot long enough, you'll never develop a flourishing society, a flourishing civilization. All right, the origin of any civilization is based on farming. All right, the origin of any civilization is based on farming. So again, if you ain't got a food culture, you ain't got a culture. All right, and let's see the height. Let's see some of the heights of indigenous culture of the Americas. It says sometime during the 1470s, a group of Native Americans followed the Gulf Stream from the Americas to Ireland. All right. Sometime in the 1470s, a group of Native Americans followed the Gulf Stream from the Americas to Ireland. What we do know is that 2 more Americans reached Galloway Bay, Ireland, and was seen by Christopher Columbus prior to his famous voyage in 1492. So part of the height of indigenous culture is the ability to sail ships. All right. Part of the height of indigenous culture is the ability to sail ships, the abilities to sail oceans. Let's walk. All right. The suspension bridge. All right. De Ganero said is an engineering feat originated from the Inca in the Andes region, who designed the bridges as they were developing their empire. All right. So part of the height of indigenous culture is the invention of the suspension bridge. All right. Here's your source, the History Channel. So the suspension bridge was invented by the Inca of South America. All right. Here's an image right here. The suspension bridge, which is what the George Washington Bridge in New York is. All right, the suspension bridge was invented by the indigenous people of the Americas. All right. Now we get into Mexico. And I'm going to show y'all the flow of these cultures. All right. The flow of these cultures, the continuity of the cultures of the indigenous people. So we got Emperor Montezuma. He was the emperor during the time of Cortez, the Spaniard Cortez. Now, if you look at that top corner, you see a building. You see a building with a dome on top. You see a building with a dome on top. Look familiar? Look familiar? All right, it's the same design of the Capitol buildings. And there's even an American Indian. There's an American Indian statue at the top of this Capitol building as well. All right, rubber. In its native regions of Central America and South America, rubber has been collected for a long time. Mesoamerican people, which include the Aztec, Olmec, and Maya, were making rubber 2,000 years ago. All right, the indigenous people of the Americas were making rubber 2,000 years ago. All right, 1735, a French scientist by the name of Charles de la Condamine visited South America and returned to Europe with the first ever samples of rubber. All right, the name rubber was credited to Joseph Priestley, a British chemist who also discovered oxygen. And here comes Charles Goodyear. Now, we always say in ISUPK the Commander General Yohana, the only thing the white man ever invented was the patent office. All right. Only thing our oppressor ever invented was the patent office. All right. Charles Goodyear, a self-taught scientist, opened up uses for rubber considerably. By discovering the vulcanization of rubber in 1839, Goodyear's vulcanized rubber was more durable and non-sticky rubber compound created through the addition of sulfur and heat. Now, this is, of course, where Goodyear tires comes from. And Goodyear tires, as of 2020, is worth $5.4 billion. Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company, as of 2020, worth $5.4 billion. And the indigenous people of the Americas have been making rubber for 2,000 years. All right. It's indigenous to the Americas. That's why. So now we see some of the architecture. All right. This is a drawing of the arrival of Cortez in Mexico. If you look at the architecture in the back, as we can see, this is not an image of a savage society. This is not an image of what the white man used to call a gentle savage. Right? We can see architecture in the back. And we're going to get into architecture a little bit when we start to see the flow, of these cultures as they start to spread north. But again, we can see we're not dealing with a savage race of people. All right, so we got an image of the indigenous people of Mexico, and we see the architecture. All right, we got a Shield of David in Mexico. All right, this is a Maya stele. And we see the Star of David, or what the world calls the Star of David, which we know when the ISUPK the Commander General Yohana, that it's not a star, but it's known as the Shield of David. All right, October 16, 1971, Professor M. Well Jakeman, Brigham Young University, published an article, Star of David in America. All right, part of the sculpture is a bas relief on a stele recently unearthed in Mexico and now in the National Museum of Mexico. It says the ear ornament is an earring which has at the center the Star of David. So here we have Israelite culture in the Americas with the indigenous people as well. All right, how Mexican vaqueros inspired the American cowboy. Hundreds of years before there was an American cowboy, there was the vaquero, an expert horseman who could adeptly herd cattle and whose skills with the lasso were legendary. Classic Westerns have cemented the image of cowboys as white Americans, but the first wave of horse riding cow wranglers in North America were indigenous Mexican men. Here's your source, the History Channel. So never let anybody tell you that cowboy culture is white culture. Never let anybody tell you that the cowboy hat, cowboy boots, jeans, etc. is white culture. All right. Nothing could be further from the truth. Here's your source right here, the History Channel. All right. Indigenous roots of cowboys. We see indigenous men here. We see Emilio Zapata. All right. Again, indigenous culture. And again, I'm gonna walk this culture. I'm gonna walk this culture down as we get into North America and the American Southeast. All right, if you look here, is an old map. All right, this is the American Southwest and into Mexico here. And you can look at the style, look at the style of the map, and look at the style of how the cities are being drawn on the map. And we're going to walk down this too. All right, so again, this is the American Southwest. This was the former territory of Mexico. All right, we're talking about California. We're talking about Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, etc., the American Southwest. All right, the Choctaw and Chickasaw were once of one tribe before their migration from some distant country to the west. The ancient domain east of the Mississippi River claims for them a Mexican origin. So again, we're going to show the flow of this culture. We're going to show the continuity of this culture. All right, Adair in his American Indian says the Choctaw and Chickasaw descended from a people called the Chickamauga, who were among the first inhabitants of the Mexican Empire. Here's your source right here. So we're going to show the flow, again, the flow of indigenous culture, all right, from South America, Central America, and into North America. All right, so the Choctaw and Chickasaw descend from a people called the Chickamauga, who were among the first inhabitants of the Mexican Empire. All right, after the conquest of Mexico by Cortez in 1520, the Aztecs left Mexico and gradually traversed the country until 1620. We find them in Alabama, where they added other bands to their ranks. The British named them Creek from the many small streams that traversed the country. Thus, the great Aztec Muskogee tribe of the Mexican Empire, vanquished by Cortez, became 100 years later the Creek Confederacy, from which branched the Seminole. Here's your source. All right, again, the continuity of this culture as it flows north. Let's walk. All right, many authors have contended that the North American Indians were descendants of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Prominent among them was James Adair, we just read about him, whose work highly useful with regard to the customs of the southeastern Indians, among whom he spent many years and was mainly devoted to proof of the proposition. All right, again, this is proof that the indigenous people not only have a continual culture that flows south to north, but these indigenous people are actually the Israelites of the Bible. All right, so now we got the American Southeast. All right, you got the Gulf of Mexico. You see Florida. All right, Georgia would be up here. Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. All right, we got East Texas right here. And all this was once Florida. But you see, the point is the very same type of maps from this time period, all right, early 1500s, and you have the very same type of architecture. The same architecture that you saw in the American Southwest and Mexico was the very same architecture you see in the American South. All right, for centuries, the Seminole tribe in Florida have been expert cattlemen and an important part of our cattle ranching history and industry. Forget what you have seen on popular Western movies, because Native Americans were anything but sidekicks to cowboy heroes. All right, the first recorded participation in organized cattle ranching by the Seminole tribe occurred in the 1740s. Now, this is important. This is important to prove this culture actually comes from indigenous people. In the 1740s, the United States doesn't exist. All right, in the 1740s, the United States does not exist. All right, there's no such thing as a white cowboy in the 1740s. All right, this is our culture. Again, never let anybody tell you that this is white culture. All right, this is the culture of the indigenous people of the Americas. All right, Texas Seminoles. Now, how did the Seminole get to Texas? Well, in 1830, we had what was called the Indian Removal Act and what became known as a Trail of Tears. So, as the Seminole were moving through the South and being removed off their land, they were concerned with being caught up in what was known as the domestic slave trade. right? As they went through Natchez, Mississippi. So what they did was they fled into Texas, because at this time, we're talking 1830, Texas was still part of Mexico. So the state of Texas that we know today didn't exist. All right. And being a part of Mexico in 1830, there was no such thing as slavery. Slavery didn't exist in Mexico at this time. So the Seminole Indians viewed Texas as the land of freedom. All right. Viewed Texas as the land of freedom. Now, what happened is after the Compromise of 1850 and 1845, when Texas became a part of the United States, you had Texas Seminoles that would be concerned what their status would be. So you had some that fled south further into Mexico, where the present day borders are, and you still have Seminole Indians on the border towns in Mexico today that celebrate Juneteenth. Then you had some that will offer United States citizenship if they join the military, and that's where your Buffalo Soldiers come from. So again, never let anybody tell you that this is white culture. All right, this is indigenous American culture. All right, this is actually a family who are descendants of Buffalo Soldiers. You can tell by the hat. All right, descendants of Texas Seminole Indian Buffalo Soldiers. And then, like I said, you still have Seminoles today, Seminole Indians today that still live in border towns in Mexico. As you can see, she's got the Mexican shirt on. All right, she's got a shirt with Mexican historical figures on it. So you still have Seminole Indians that live in border towns in Mexico today that celebrate Juneteenth. All right, 1514, DeSoto attended a feast with the Chickasaw tribe in present-day Mississippi, where a pig was roasted on a barbecue. So we're talking about indigenous culture. We're talking about American Indian culture. Salakia. Barbecue comes from the indigenous people of the Americas. Here's your source. All right, barbecue comes from the indigenous people of the Americas. All right, again, if you don't have a food culture, you don't have a culture. All right, here's a Chickasaw Indian cowboy. All right, people outside barbecuing. Again, that is an indigenous American. Barbecue is indigenous American culture. All right, Native American origin of gumbo. All right, it's a tradition shared now, but we learned it from the Native Americans. All right, gumbo is indigenous American food culture. All right, the indigenous people don't often receive that level of credit, though in the complicated origin story of gumbo, for years, historians and cookbook authors promoted a story that gumbo started simmering on stovetops after an incident known as the Frying Pan Revolt. All right, it says here, when Bienville foisted the women of his housekeeper onto his housekeeper, who taught them what she had learned from Choctaw people about cooking with local ingredients. All right, gumbo comes from Choctaw Indians in Mississippi. All right, gumbo is American Indian culture. All right, people learned it. The French learned it. The French that lived in Louisiana before it was sold to the United States in 1811. The French learned how to make gumbo from the Choctaw Indians in Mississippi. All right, to a far greater degree than anyone realizes, several of the most important food dishes that Native Americans, such as the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Creek of the southeastern United States live on today, is the soul food eaten by both black and white Southerners. How many, for example, is still eaten? Grits and cornbread used by Southern cooks. All right, so what we know of as soul food is indigenous to the Americas. All right, the cornbread, the corn itself, like I said, the most popular grain in the world, the most important grain in the world is indigenous to the Americas. All right, cornbread is indigenous to the Americas. The fact that if you eat everything, if you cut up and cook onion and bell pepper and everything you cook, all right, that is indigenous American culture. All right, sweet potato pie is indigenous to the Americas. Tomatoes are indigenous to the Americas. All right, Italians were not cooking spaghetti as we know of today because tomatoes are indigenous to the Americas. All right, all of this is an indigenous American food culture. All right, Choctaw Indians, again, down there in Mississippi. All right, Indian boiled cornbread is present in Southern cuisine as cornmeal dumplings and hush puppies. All right, hush puppies are indigenous to the Americas. All right, Southerners cook their beans and field peas by boiling them, as did Native tribes. And like the Native Americans, Southerners cured their meats and smoked it over hickory coals. All right, the most popular coal in barbecue today, the most popular wood used in barbecue today, hands down, is hickory. And again, that comes from the American Indian. All right, here's your source, Modern Farmer. It says it happened on an exploratory day in the Chickasaw Nation in a far-flung corner of Oklahoma when I cracked open a self-published cookbook and was shocked by the familiarity of the recipes within. The grits, the cornbread, the sweet potato pie, chicken and dumplings in the book looked like a replica of my mother-in-law's family recipes in South Alabama. All right, this is all indigenous American food culture. All right, all of this is forgotten and unknown American Indian culture. All right, grits, cornbread, sweet potato pie, chicken and dumplings, all of this is the food of the indigenous people of the Americas. All right, cornbread, here's your proof. You want more proof? Here it is. Here it is. Merriam-Webster's dictionary. Look up Indian bread. The definition of Indian bread is cornbread. Again, you don't have cornbread without corn, and you don't have corn without an American Indian. You don't have corn without the indigenous people of the Americas. You don't have onions and bell pepper. You don't have chocolate. You don't have tomatoes. You don't have onion and bell pepper. You don't have barbecue. You don't have greens. You don't have sweet potato pie. You don't have none of these things. You don't have hush puppies. You don't have none of these things without the indigenous people of the Americas. Again, we still today feed 60% of the world. 60% of the food that the world eats comes from right here. All right, 60% of the food that the world eats comes from right here. All right, Tulsa. Oh, now we finna get into Black Wall Street, y'all. Let's get into Black Wall Street. All right, Tulsa's origin began with the removal of the Creek Indians from the ancestral homelands in Georgia and Alabama. Arriving in 1833, the Creek Indians began building the city of Tulsa after a negotiation with the Cherokee over boundaries. Here's your source. All right, prosperous communities were built both in Indian Territory and Oklahoma before statehood in 1907. They supported local businesses, schools, newspapers, and churches. All right, oil in Indian Territory. Again, Oklahoma was the territory that the Indians of the Southeast, the Indians of the South, all right, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, etc. We're talking about the Indians of the South, known as the 5 civilized tribes, were being removed into Oklahoma in the 1830s. So again, Indian Territory has been Oklahoma for a long time. All right, most Oklahomans know the history behind the title given to the city of Tulsa, oil capital of the world. Major oil strikes were made before the surrounding territory was even granted statehood. All right, 1884, the Cherokee Nation passed a law permitting the organization of a company for the purpose of finding petroleum or rock oil, thus increasing the revenue of the Cherokee Nation. Now, why is this important? Because, again, you have to know chronology. All right. If you don't know chronology, somebody finna wipe the floor with you. All right. Knowing chronology, I know that you don't have any non-Indian people step foot in Oklahoma until the 1890s. You don't see non-Indian people step foot in Indian Territory in Oklahoma until the 1890s. But in 1884, the Cherokee Nation was striking deals with major company, all right, to do something with the oil that was struck in Indian Territory. All right, like the 5 civilized tribes relocation to Indian Territory, the Osage Indians was repositioned to Indian Territory and prospered with oil-rich land in Osage County. Over the next 2 decades, Indian Territory would produce more wealth than all of the American gold rushes combined. Here's your source. All right, over the next 2 decades, Indian Territory would produce more wealth than all of the American gold rushes combined. Now you see the jealousy of our oppressor in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Now you see the wealth that was produced in Tulsa. Now you see the wealth in Black Wall Street. And now you see why. Now you see the motive behind, the real motive behind the jealousy of our oppressor and the destruction of Black Wall Street. It says over the next 2 decades, Indian Territory would produce more wealth than all of the American gold rushes combined. Let's walk. Again, Oklahoma's always been Indian Territory. All right, Tulsa, a creek settlement, got a huge boost when nearby Glenpool oil field was discovered in the early part of this century. Oil barons gave the town its Art Deco stamp and left behind Price's legacy of art and architecture. All right, Tulsa, Oklahoma was a creek settlement. All right, Tulsa, Oklahoma was a Creek Indian settlement. And the Creek and the Cherokee were the ones that discovered oil and started the oil rush in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And again, this is what created the wealth in Tulsa. This is what created oil barons in Tulsa. But again, never forget that Tulsa was a Creek Indian settlement. All right, after emancipation, we're talking 1865. All right, freedmen who had followed the 5 civilized tribes on the Trail of Tears could not claim land. They migrated westward through Kansas in the 1870s and 1880s, and then blazed Gurley's path through Oklahoma Territory in the 1890s. When it's talking about Gurley, it's talking about O.W. Gurley. It's talking about the founder of Black Wall Street. And it said that his trail was blazed by Indian freedmen who followed the civilized tribes on the Trail of Tears. All right, Indian freedmen is what paved the way for O.W. Gurley and Black Wall Street. Let's find out who these freedmen were. All right, the aim of this pictorial is to demonstrate that the domestic slave trade had reduced ethnic Native Americans to African slaves for the sale, and that they too had been freed and or received benefit from emancipation by its effect upon the Indian nations to abolish slavery by the subsequent 1866 treaties and allow tribal people from Texas and Oklahoma to rejoin family groups. Here's your source. The point is the domestic slave trade, the Indian slave trade that was taking place in Natchez, Mississippi. It said had reduced ethnic Native Americans to African slaves for sale, and that they had to have been freed and or received the benefit from emancipation. This is where you get the term freedmen from. All right, freedmen were not African slaves. All right, freedmen were, as according to the source here, freedmen were ethnic Native Americans. All right, Black tribal members who were classified as freedmen by the Dawes Commission benefited from the allotment process. They were granted approximately 2 million acres of property, the largest transfer of land wealth to Black people in the history of the United States. We already read that when the Creek and the Cherokee struck oil, all right, they produced more wealth than any of the American gold rushes combined. Right here, these freedmen who we just read were ethnic Native Americans that got reduced to the status of an African slave, were granted 2 million acres of property, the largest transfer of land wealth to Black people in the history of the United States. All right, this is Black excellence right here. And these are the men, these are the people that paved the way for O.W. Gurley and Black Wall Street. Again, now we have motive for the jealousy of our oppressor to burn down Black Wall Street. All right, B.C. Franklin was a Choctaw tribal member who later became a prominent Tulsa attorney. And this is outside his law office, Oklahoma, 1910. All right, Choctaw tribal member in Black Wall Street. All right, in Black Wall Street. Again, these freedmen who we read were ethnic Native Americans who were caught up in the domestic slave trade, Natchez, Mississippi, whose status had been reduced to an African slave. All right, these are the freedmen it's talking about in Oklahoma. These are the freedmen it's talking about in Oklahoma. These were the people that during this land grab, when Indian territory was being portioned out, these freedmen, shout out to my freedmen, by the way, these were the people that took 2 million acres of land in Indian territory, all right, of which Tulsa, Oklahoma was part of. And again, this was the largest land wealth distribution to Black people in the history of the United States. And this is what paved the way for O.W. Gurley and Black Wall Street. And again, this was the motive for the jealousy of our oppressor for the destruction of Black Wall Street. All right, let's talk about the music that changed the world. Let's talk about the music that changed the world. Let's talk about this music that changed the world. If you're not familiar with who this is, all right, this is Charlie Patton. All right, this is Charlie Patton. And let's get into who Charlie Patton was. Again, we're talking about forgotten American Indian culture. All right, the culture of the indigenous people of the Americas. Let's talk about the music that changed the world. All right, here's Charlie Patton. All right, Mississippi Delta blues is considered the origin of American music because it influenced all other genres, including rock and roll, R&B, gospel, country, and rap. All right, Mississippi Delta blues is the mother of all music genres. There would be no music today in America that we know of without Mississippi Delta blues. All right, this is the origin, Salakia, this is the origin of the most popular music in the world. All right, again, our food culture, the food culture of the American Indian still feeds 60% of the world today. Our food culture that we see has continued from South America into Central America into the American South is known as soul food today, is the most popular food in the world today. Still feeds 60% of the world today. And now we have our music culture that's the most popular music in the world today. All right, I hear they're doing Chicago drill music in Africa right now. All right, they're listening to 50 Cent in China and Japan. All right, the most influential music in the world originates in the Mississippi Delta. Let's walk. All right, in that same area that the Delta Blues began, lived many members of this tribe who were of Choctaw descent. One of these men is Charlie Patton, credited by all as the father of Delta Blues. All right, so Mississippi Blues, the father of Mississippi Blues was a Choctaw Indian named Charlie Patton. And again, Mississippi Blues is the origin of all American music today. Without Charlie Patton, without this American Indian, you don't get rap music. You don't get country music. You don't get rock and roll. You get nothing. All right. Without a Choctaw Indian named Charlie Patton, credited by all as the father of Delta Blues. Let's walk. Mississippi is considered the birthplace of American music. All right. There's nothing else to be said. I don't give a damn about where so-called rap music, hip-hop music was invented. I could give a damn. The birthplace of American music is in Mississippi, and it comes from a Choctaw Indian named Charlie Patton. Let's walk. All right, Native Americans were not credited for helping form blues, jazz, and rock. Again, the forgotten American Indian culture. Indigenous people have just been swept under the rug. All right, indigenous people have just been swept under the rug. Let's walk. Now I'm finna hurt some feelings here. This might be a little controversial. All right, McKinley Morganfield, aka Muddy Waters. Now, this was the man that took the music of Charlie Patton and went up north, went to Chicago, hooked up with a white boy named Leonard Chess. And we've all seen Cadillac Records. All right, when Muddy Waters moved to Chicago, hooked up with Leonard Chess, they took Mississippi Delta blues and made it famous. All right, they took Mississippi blues and made it famous. So without Muddy Waters moving to Chicago, without hooking up with Chess Records, all right, we might not have American music as we know today, because it was a Chicago producer and a Chicago record company that made Muddy Waters and Mississippi blues famous. Now, here's your source: Native American influence in the history of blues. Now, why is Muddy Waters being talked about in a book called Native American Influence in the History of Blues? It says, consider the description of Muddy Waters, born McKinley Morganfield, on the occasion of Waters' first recording session in a shack in Stovall in 1940 for the song collector Alan Lomax. Muddy was a vigorous 26-year-old, Palmer writes, with high cheekbones, cool hooded eyes, and features that lent him a certain oriental inscrutability. All right, so it's alluding to the fact, it's not coming right out and saying, but it's alluding to the fact that Muddy Waters looked very Indian. Now we're finna take it a step further. All right, Indian removal in the Southern Black Belt. 1832, the United States increased the pressure on the Choctaw to remove at Pontotoc, the capital of the Chickasaw Nation. The United States threatened to leave the Chickasaw to the mercy of the Mississippi state law if they did not move west. Now, the Choctaw were already given statehood. Or Salaki, the Choctaw were already given citizenship in Mississippi, but the Chickasaw were being forced to leave. All right. But the point is, Pontotoc, Mississippi, was the capital of the Chickasaw Empire in 1832. All right. 1832, you have the United States trying to force the Chickasaw to leave Pontotoc. This is 1832. This is why chronology is so important. 1832, the United States increased pressure to Chickasaw to remove. And again, Pontotoc was the capital city of the Chickasaw Nation. All right, Muddy Waters' great-grandfather. All right, birth 1830. This is 2 years before the Chickasaw was being forced to leave Pontotoc, Mississippi. And look where he's from, Pontotoc, Mississippi. So in 1830, 2 years before Chickasaw removal, you have Muddy Waters' great-grandfather born in Pontotoc, Mississippi, the capital of the Chickasaw Nation. All right. Again, that might be a little bit controversial for some folk. All right, because now, if that's controversial, where do you see this one? Source: Bureau of American Ethnology to the Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, 1897-98. It says a considerable proportion of the blood of the Southern Negro is unquestionably Indian. Now, there's been a lot of talk. I've been hearing that when people say that the grandma or that grandpa was Indian, you know, people get a lot of flack from it, right? But I'm here to tell you, look, if your grandma or your grandpa told you was Indian, all right, who gives a damn about what some Pan-African thinks? Who gives a damn when some Pan-African says, oh, you're just ashamed of being black? You just don't want to be black. All right, who gives a damn about what some Pan-African says? All right here, tell them to beat this source. Bureau of American Ethnology to the Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, 1897-98. It says a considerable proportion of the blood of the Southern Negro is unquestionably Indian. All right. So whatever your grandma or your grandpa told you, roll with that. And the hell with what some Pan-African got to say about it. All right, show them this. Matter of fact, show them this. I'll leave this up for a second. You can believe what some Pan-African says. You got some Pan-African that's trying to be like, oh, you just ashamed of being black. You just don't want to be black. You'll be anything but black. But this is what the Bureau of American Ethnology says. All right, I'll leave this up here for a second. If you want to write down this source, next time you got a battle of Pan-African over what your grandma or your grandpa told you, like they don't know. Let's walk. Lena Horne. All right, famous American actress. Here's her paternal grandfather, Edwin Fletcher Horne. Even this Wakanda nonsense is ours. All right, Kansas historical marker, Wakanda Springs. All right, Wakanda has nothing to do with some fake Black Panther, some fake African nation. All right, some fake movie trying to Africanize people. All right, Wakanda is even ours. All right, Wakanda Water, Wakanda Springs, Kansas. See the Indian head? Again, this is Forgotten American Indian Culture Part 2. And if you look down here, see the Indian head? See the word Wakanda? All right, there's been this need to Africanize people for quite some time. But Officer Howard Moore, ISUPK Kentucky, and Commanding General Yohana is here to take it back. That's why. All right, from my observation, United States history is not as clean as the education system might present in its curricula. And again, this is why I do this class. This is why I do this Monday history class, to teach what is forgotten. All right, to teach what's unknown, to teach what you didn't learn in history class. All right, this country was built on stolen cultures and legacies. Our country was built on stealing the cultural expressions and subverting the great legacies of the original people, and of those legacies being the Native American people. Native American history is often omitted or altered in textbooks, including school curricula. All right, we already talked about the food that still feeds 60% of the world today. We already talked about the music that changed the world. Our culture is the most influential culture in the world today. All right, our culture is the most influential culture in the world today. All right, there are approximately 627 treaties between the U.S. government and Native American people. All right, the Native American peoples, according to the American Indian Truth radio program, July 2015, our federal government broke every last one of them, never followed through with one treaty. According to the same radio program, before white Americans landed in America, there were 1,200 thriving Native tribes. But when the European got here, the governments they set up manipulated the Native people and conducted heinous genocidal practices on them. Because of their actions, there are a little over 500 existing tribes today. And again, not only genocide through conquest, and don't believe the nonsense that their conquest was done militarily. All right, the bow and arrow was superior to their colonial musket. All right, the bow and arrow was superior in every way to their colonial musket. All right, you shoot one time, you miss. It takes 5 minutes to reload it. You know how many arrows I can get off by the time it takes you to load round number 2? All right, their military conquest was done through disease and allies with other American Indians. All right, allies with other American Indians. For example, the Spaniards, there was no way the Spaniards could defeat the Aztec without the aid of the Toltec. All right, without the Toltec being enemies of the Aztec, there's no way in the world a boat full of Spaniards could have whooped the Aztec. No way, no way in the world. So disease and allies with other tribes that we were in conflict with. All right, let's walk. All right, the very little history we do know about Native people isn't enough. Our textbooks in high school and college don't necessarily inform us that Benjamin Franklin, along with the founding fathers of the U.S., befriended the Iroquois and created the U.S. Constitution. However, the ideas and principles in it were stolen from a document known as the Great Law of Peace, written by the Iroquois Confederacy, according to the same American Indian Truth broadcast. Again, what we learn about in high school and in textbooks, they ain't finna tell you nothing. They ain't finna tell you nothing. That's why your brother here, all right, Officer 500 Howard Marr, ISUPK, Kentucky, is here to bring what you didn't learn in history class, what these textbooks isn't finna tell you. All right. And again, the Constitution was taken from an Iroquois document known as the Great Law of Peace, all right, written by the Iroquois Confederation. Even their document, all right, their United States Constitution that supposedly so-called created the greatest nation in the world is our culture too. All right, is our culture too. Everything from our food culture that feeds 60% of the world today, to our music that influenced the world, even down to the document that founded the so-called greatest nation that ever exists, is American Indian culture too. All right, again, comes from the Iroquois Confederation, and you can see the continuity of the culture. You see the Shield of David on the child. Remember the Shield of David on the stele in Mexico? All right, this is the continuation of the culture. All right, Iroquois Great Law of Peace and the United States Constitution. We just read how the Constitution was taken from an American Indian document called the Great Law of Peace. And now we're talking about the Iroquois. We're talking about Indians in the Northeast. And as you can see, they had the same type of architecture in the Northeast that they had in the American South, that they had in the Southwest, that they had in Mexico. Again, the continuity of the culture of American Indian people. All right, let's drop that. Let's go to the Bible real quick before we end it. All right, Psalm 83 and 4. Psalm 83 and 4, they have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. All right, they have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation. That's why we don't know American Indian culture. All right, that's why your brother, Officer Howard Marr at ISUPK, Kentucky, has to come and give it to you. All right, our enemy, our 500-year open enemy, has cut us off from being a nation. All right, that the name of Israel may no more be in remembrance. Again, we just saw the Shield of David on the Iroquois family in the American Northeast, and we saw the Shield of David, that very same Shield of David, that Israelite symbol, the name of King David, the signet of King David. We seen that very same signet on a stele from Mexico. And we read how We read how indigenous people of Mexico traveled to the American South, traveled to Alabama, traveled to Georgia, traveled to Florida, traveled to Mississippi, came from Mexico, and started these tribes in the American South. Again, showing the cultural continuity of the indigenous people of the Americas. And let's finish this off. Since we just had so-called Thanksgiving, I know the whole world celebrated Thanksgiving. Well, let's get to some history here. This is Zaviah Mitchell, all right, direct descendant of Massasoit, chief of the Wampanoags. All right, now we actually get an image of how the people look, how the indigenous people look when the colonizer got here. All right, this is Zaviah Mitchell, direct descendant. All right, 1878, descendant of Chief Massasoit of the Wampanoags. Here's a photograph of her. Again, we actually get to put a face. We actually get to put a face of the indigenous people in the Northeast that met the colonizer. All right, and where we get the myth of Thanksgiving from. We actually get to put a face on the people because she is a direct descendant of the people of the first contact with European colonizers and the start of the very first Indian War in North America. Again, Zaviah Mitchell. And let's read about her ancestors. All right. Whenever the month of November rolls around, most Americans prepare for Thanksgiving dinner. In American schools across the nation, the plight of the pilgrim was always the highlight and focus of the telling of those 1620 meals in which Chief Massasoit of the Wampanoag was invited and brought many of his people to the feast. All right, this is the fairy tale that we're told in school. However, it was Massasoit's son, Chief Metacom, also known as King Philip of the Wampanoag people, who suffered cruelly by the Plymouth colony, which started the First Indian War. Ultimately, Metacom was beheaded and drawn and quartered. Subsequently, Metacoma's head was sold for 30 shillings to the Plymouth colony, the going rate for an Indian head at the time. The head was spiked and carried throughout the streets of Plymouth before it was put on display at Plymouth Colony for the next 25 years. Knowing that one could profit from an Indian head in the American colonies, including the heads of men, women, and children, became open season on the lives of American Indian people. In celebration, the Massachusetts Bay Colony held a Thanksgiving that included kicking the heads of Pequot people through the streets like soccer balls. All right, this is the real history of Thanksgiving that we'll end the class with. And again, Zaviah Mitchell was a direct descendant of the Wampanoag people, the people that were involved in the first conflict. And we actually get to put a face on the indigenous people through a direct descendant in Zaviah Mitchell. All right, so with that, we'll go ahead and end it. All right, I appreciate y'all joining in. All right, ISUPK Kentucky, under Commander General Yohana, Monday night history class. Again, tune in Tuesday, brotherhood class, Wednesday law class, Wednesday night podcast. All right, shalom. Yahweh Ba'Shem, Yahweh Shabbat Thumb, Yahweh Shemalatham Ba'Shem.